안녕하세요. 꾸준한 영어 테드쌤입니다. 오늘도 낭독 해보도록 하겠습니다. 이제 8번 말고 챕터 1 100번입니다. 와, 100번 읽기 쉽지 않네요. 500번을 읽어야 하는데 지금 챕터별로 나눠서 100번을 읽고 있습니다. 그죠? 네, 쉽지 않습니다. 네, 어떤 이유를 달지 않겠습니다. 네. 그 전에 재밌는 표현 한번 익혀보도록 할게요. 오늘 준비한 재밌는 표현은 사실 제가 너무 졸려요 지금. 이런 얘기 잘하잖아요. 그러니까 계속 졸립니다. 아우 졸린다. 계속 졸립니다. 이런 표현들인데 회사 오는 길에도 계속 졸면서 왔어. 아이고 졸리네. 수업 시간 중에 계속 졸았어. 자, 어떤 표현이 있을까요? 이게 doze라는 표현이 있어요. doze. doze라는 표현을 써서 졸다라는 표현인데요. I kept dozing off on the way to work today. I kept dozing off. 아, 졸린다. I kept dozing off in class. 수업 시간에 계속 졸았어. 이런 말입니다. 이게 이제 조는 상태가 어떤 거냐면 이렇게 꾸벅꾸벅 졸다가 정신 번쩍 차리고 또 일어났다가 꾸벅 졸다가 버떡 차리고 일어났다가 이런 상황 있죠. 그럴 때를 doze라는 말을 써서 dozing off 하면 됩니다. 자, I kept dozing off at the way to work today. I kept dozing off. I kept dozing off in class. 괜찮지 않습니까? 자, 여러분들이 조금이라도 사용하는 데 도움이 될 수 있는 표현들 계속해서 소개해 볼 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 자, 이제 낭독을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 이제 8번만 하면 100번입니다. 오, 졸리다는 표현 썼더니 저도 졸리네요. 아, 낮입니다. 그죠? 되게 졸리네요. 자, 졸려도 졸음을 이겨내고 또 읽어야겠죠. 자, 한번 해볼게요. 8번만 더 하면 됩니다. Okay, chapter 1. The arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That's something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold. You are the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them, as if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen. And the people think you are being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice, whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking that first night. Well, it was cold, the rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd taken out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightens Chester more than vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare, I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a bundle with tiny, glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad." "Take your boots off. You are soaking wet," replied his mother, somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. But, Mom, what about— First, stop dripping on the carpet. Would somebody like to take this? Asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with the eyes. I'd like to remove my coat. I will, Pete yelled. Oh no, I will, Toby. I found him. You will drop him. I will not. You will too. Mom, Pete punched me. I'll take him, said Mrs. Monroe. Take off your coat this minute. But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coats that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. Harold, cried Toby, guess what happened to me? And then all over again. Everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something. In our family, everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. They're good for the animals as well as the people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never been just a good boy, Harold, or use the little box gesture at our house. Oh no, with us it's, hey Harold, Dad got a raise, and now we're in a higher tax bracket. Or come sit on the bed, Chester, and watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you will see a relative, which shows you just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor, and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer. So we think of it as a rather special household, and we are, therefore, rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived at the theater late, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly, so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see just what it was he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was the little blanket bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit, sitting in a shoebox filled with dirt. A piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and the Russian wolfhound happens to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian Mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, take good care of my baby. 어, 오후가 되어서 정신없이 졸리네. But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a beloved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Munro and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Peter ran outside to find the crate, and Mrs. Munro went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moseyed over to a corner of the room. We looked at each other. Well, what do you think? I asked. I don't think rabbits like milk, he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation. because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma, Toby broke the rabbit's house." "I didn't, I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it. It's too big. Toby's too little." "I'm not. You're two." "Okay, fellas," Mrs. Murner called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. "Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible, please." Chester turned to me and said under his breath, "That lettuce looks repulsive. But if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. "Mom, Toby says he's gonna keep the rabbit in his room." "That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room." "Only sometimes," I thought, "when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer." Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt that he shared his stash with me. It was, after all, at one of those late night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake, and Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing, and the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned me by my ears, so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. "But he's mine," Toby said. "I found him." "You sat on him, you mean?" "I found him, and he's sleeping in my room." "You can keep Smelly Old Harold in your room, and Chester too, if you want to, but I'm gonna keep the rabbit in mine." Smelly Old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly indeed. Mr. Monroe spoke up. "I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room, on that table by the window. It's light there, and he will get lots of fresh air." "Peter's taller than I am," Toby cried. "He will be able to see the rabbit better." "Too bad, Squirt." "Okay," said Mrs. Munoz through clenched teeth. "Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep." "Why?" Pete asked. "I don't want to go to sleep." Mrs. Munoz smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. "Look, Ma," said Toby, "he's not drinking his milk." Chester nudged me in the ribs. "Didn't I tell you?" he asked. "Excuse me while I make myself available." "Hey," said Toby, "we gotta name him." "Can that wait until tomorrow?" asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison. "No, he has to have a name right now." I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the three most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were really gonna call me Fluffy as Mrs. Monroe had suggested. "Well, all right," sighed Mrs. Monroe. "What about, oh, say, Bun Bun?" "Uh-oh, there she goes again," I thought. "Where did she get them?" "Yuck," we all said. "Well, then, how about Fluffy?" she offered hopefully. Peter looked at his mother and smiled. "You never give up, do you, Mom?" Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Monroe's ankles and purring loudly. "No, Chester, not now," she said, pushing him aside. "He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester?" Toby asked, as he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. "Come on, Harold," Toby called. "You've got to help her with the name, too." I joined the family and the serious thinking began. We all peered into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. "So this is a rabbit," I thought. "He sort of looks like a Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail and a motor in his nose." "Well," said Pete after a moment, Since we found him at the movies, why don't you call him Mr. Johnson? There was a moment of silence. Who's Mr. Johnson? Asked Toby. The guy who owns the movie theater. Pete answered. No one seemed to like the idea. How about the prince? Ah, said Mr. Monroe. Dad, said Toby. Are you kidding? Well, I had a dog named the Prince once. He replied lamely. Prince, I thought. Prince, I thought that's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula, Toby said. That's a stupid name, said Pete. No, it's not, and anyway, I found him, so I should get to name him. Mom, you're not gonna let him name him, are you? That's favoritism, and I'll be traumatized if you do. Mrs. Mooney looked in wonder at Pete. Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula, cried Toby. Please, 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 and with each please, he squeezed the Chester a little harder. Mrs. Mooney picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, Let's not have any more arguments. We'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him at a Dracula movie, so we'll call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula. That should make everybody happy, including me. What about me? Muttered Chester. I won't be happy until she puts down the milk. Well, guys, is that okay with you? She asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another, and then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. Yeah, Ma, I think that name is just right. Pete shrugged. It's okay, but I get to feed him. Okay, I'm gonna put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he will drink it tomorrow. What about Chester? Toby said, dropping the friendly cat to the floor. Maybe he would like it. Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Monroe and looked up at her plaintively. Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester? You've already had your milk today. She reached down, patted Chester on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Chester didn't move. Okay, bedtime, said Mr. Monroe. Good night, Bunnicula, Toby said. Good night, Count Bunnicula, Pete said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. I licked Toby good night. Good night, smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester. I drew on Peter's foot. Mom, Harold drew on my foot. Good night, Pete, Mrs. Munner said with great finality as she came back into the living room. And then more calmly, Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. Mr. and Mrs. Munner went up the stairs together. You know, dear, Mr. Munner said, that was very clever. Bunnicula, I could never have thought of a name like that. Oh, I don't know, Robert. She smiled as she put her arm through his. I think Prince is a lovely name, too. The room was quiet. Chester was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly he turned to me. I wish that they had named him Fluffy, was all he said. 우와, 졸음을 참아가면서 네, 어마무지한 인내력으로 지금 한 번을 읽었습니다. 또 읽겠습니다. 자꾸 읽어야 됩니다. 처음 읽었을 때보다는 조금 그래도 많이 좋아졌죠. 이걸 얼마나 제가 이 독백하는 걸 많이 보실지는 몰라도 저에게 체면을 걸기 위해서라도 저는 계속해서 저에게 말을 걸면서 끝까지 해낼 겁니다. 끝까지 해야 되고 끝까지 할 겁니다. 예, 끝까지 했을 때 제가 변하는 모습 저도 너무너무 기대됩니다. 근데 현실적으로 체력이 딸리지만 또 읽어보겠습니다. Chapter 1 The Arrival I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That's something they always always say to me when they go out, "Take care of the house, Harold. You are the watchdog." I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them. As if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen. And people think you are being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about the first night. It was cold, the rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chatter was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd taken out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightens Chester more than vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard the car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a bundle with tiny glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad." "Take your boots off. You're soaking wet," replied his mother, somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. "But, Mom, what about—" "First, stop dripping on the carpet. Would somebody like to take this?" asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with the eyes. "I'd like to remove my coat." "I will," Pete yelled. "No, I will," said Toby. "I found him. You will drop him." "I will not. You are too." "Mom, Pete punched me." "I will take him," said Mrs. Monroe. "Take off your coat this minute." But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coats that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. "Harold," cried Toby, "guess what happened to me?" And then, all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something. In our family, everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as the people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never been just a good boy, Harold, or use the little box chapter at our house. Oh no, with us it's, "Hey Harold, dad got a raise and now we are in a higher tax bracket." Or, "Come sit on the bed, chatter, and watch this Quiet Kingdom show." Maybe you will see a relative, which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer, so we think of it as a rather special household, and we are therefore rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with those glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived at their theater late, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly. So they wanted to disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see what it was he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was the little blanket bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and here in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit, Sitting in a shoebox filled with dirt, a piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the mourners were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I digress. But a mongrel. But I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and the Russian wolfhound happens to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian Mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby." But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a beloved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Monroe and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find the crate, and Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moved over to the corner of the room. We looked at each other. "Well, what do you think?" I asked. "I don't think rabbits like milk," he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma, Toby broke the rabbit's house." "I didn't, I just dropped it." "Pete won't let me carry it. It's too big, Toby's too little." "I'm not your toy." "Okay, fellas," Mrs. Murner called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. "Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible, please." Chester turned to me and said under his breath, "That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. "Ma, Toby says he's gonna keep the rabbit in his room." "That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room." "Only sometimes," I thought, "when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer." Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't hurt that he shared his stash with me. But it was, after all, at one of those late-night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake, and Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing, and the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned me by my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. "But he's mine," Toby said. "I found him." "You sat on him? You mean?" "I found him, and he's sleeping in my room." "You can keep Smelly Old Harold in your room, and Chester too, if you want to, but I'm gonna keep the rabbit in mine." Smelly Old Harold! I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly, indeed. Mr. Monroe spoke up. "I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room, on that table by the window. It's light there, and he will get lots of fresh air." "Peter's taller than I am," Toby cried. "He will be able to see the rabbit better." "Too bad, Squirt." "Okay," said Mrs. Monroe through clenched teeth. "Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep." "Why?" Pete asked. "I don't want to go to sleep." Mrs. Monroe smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. "Look, Ma," said Toby. "He's not drinking his milk." Chester nudged me in the ribs. "Didn't I tell you?" he asked. "Excuse me while I make myself available." "Hey," said Toby, "we gotta name him." "Can that wait until tomorrow?" asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison, "No, he has to have a name right now." I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the three most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were really going to call me Fluffy as Mrs. Monroe had suggested. "Well, all right," sighed Mrs. Monroe. "What about Ossie Bonbon?" "Uh-oh, there she goes again," I thought. "Where did she get them?" "Yuck," we all said. Well then, how about Fluffy? She offered hopefully. Peter looked at his mother and smiled. You never give up, do you, Mom? Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Moore's ankles and purring loudly. No, Chester, not now, she said, pushing him aside. You want to help us name him, don't you, Chester? Toby asked, and he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. Come on, Harold, Toby called. You've got to help her with the name, too. I joined the family and the serious thinking began. We all peered into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. So this is a rabbit, I thought. He sort of looks like a Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail and a motor in his nose. Well, said Pete, after a moment, since we found him at the movies, why don't you call him Mr. Johnson? There was a moment of silence. Who's Mr. Johnson? Asked Toby. The guy who owns the movie theater. Pete answered. No one seemed to like the idea. How about the prince? Said Mr. Monroe. Dad said, Toby, are you kidding? Well, I had a dog named the Prince once, he replied lamely. Prince, I thought that's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula, Toby said. That's a stupid name, said Pete. No, it's not. And anyway, I found him, so I should get to name him. Mom, you're not gonna let him name him, are you? That's favoritism, and I'll be traumatized if you do. Mrs. Moon looked in wonder at Pete. Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula, cried Toby. Please, 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 and with each please, he squeezed the chattel a little harder. Mrs. Munro picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chattel followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, Let's not have any more argument. We'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him at a Dracula movie, so we'll call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula. That should make everybody happy, including me. What about me? Muttered the Chester. I won't be happy until she puts down the milk. Well, guys, is that okay with you? She asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another, and then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. Yeah, Ma, I think the name is just right. Pete shrugged. It's okay, but I get to feed him. Okay, I'm gonna put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he will drink it tomorrow. What about Chatter? Toby said, dropping the panty cap to the floor. Maybe he would like it. Chatter made a beeline for Mrs. Munro and looked up at her plaintively. Oh, Chatter doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chatter? You've already had your milk today. She reached down, patted Chatter on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Chatter didn't move. Okay, bedtime, said Mr. Munro. Good night, Bunnicula, Toby said. Good night, Count Bunnicula, Pete said sarcastically. In what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent, I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a particular movement from the cage. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. I licked Toby good night. Good night, smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester. I drooled on Peter's foot. Mom, Harold drooled on my foot. Good night, Pete. Mrs. Munoz said with great finality as she came back into the living room. And then more calmly, good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went up the stairs together. You know, dear, Mr. Monroe said, that was very clever of Bunnicula. I could never have thought of a name like that. Oh, I don't know, Robert. She smiled as she put her arm through his. I think Prince is a lovely name, too. The room was quiet. Chatter was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly he turned to me. I wish they had named him Fluffy, was all he said. 우, 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 우. 두 번, 두 번, 두 번, 두 번. 네, 이제 세 번째 또 있습니다. Bunnicula. 세 번째였습니다. 최대한 빨리 읽어보겠습니다. Chapter 1. The Arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That is something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold, and you're the ones that I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them. As if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen, and the people think you are being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my fifth rug in front of a nice whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about the first night where it was cold, the rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chatter was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow next to grasshoppers. There is nothing that frightens Chatter more than the vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Murners, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Murner. There was a flash of lightning, and in each glare, I noticed that Mr. Murner was carrying a bundle with a tiny glistening light. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad." Take your boots up. You're soaking wet, replied his mother. As somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. But Mom, what about? First, stop dripping on the carpet. Would somebody like to take this? Asked Mr. Mono, indicating the bundle with the eyes. I'd like to remove my coat. I will, Pete yelled. No, I will, said Toby. I found him. You were dropping him. I know you were too. Mom, Pete punched me. I'll take him, said Mrs. Mono. Take off your coat at this minute. But she became so involved in having the boys out of their coat that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. Harold cried to guess what happened to me, and then all over again, everyone started talking. It was at this point I feel I must explain something in our family. Everything treats everyone else with greater respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as the people. Everything that happened to them is explained to us. It's never been just a good boy Harold or you the little boss Chatter or at our house. Oh no, with us it's hey Harold, dad got a raise and now we are in a higher tax bracket, or come sit on bed, Chatter. And watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you will see a relative, which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Mono is a college professor and Mrs. Mono is a lawyer, so we think of it as a rather special household, and we are therefore rather special pets. So it wasn't at all, or so it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes now among us. It seemed that it seems that they had arrived at the theater late, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the restaurant, which was empty. That they tiptoed in and sat down very quietly, so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Muller told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said that he wanted to see just what it was he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and then Mr. Muller borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was a little blanket bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Muller's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rat, sitting in a shoebox filled with dirt. A piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Mullers were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a battle. Now, most of people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and the Russian Wolfhound happens to be one of them because my family got along a lot. I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian Mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby," but I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Mono and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find a crate, and Mrs. Mono went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Mono sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chatter, and the two of us casually moved over to a corner of the room. We looked at each other. Well, what do you think? I asked. I don't think rabbits like milk, he answered. Chatter and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma, Toby broke the rabbit's house." I didn't. I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it. It's too big. Toby's too little. I'm not your too. Okay, fellas, Mrs. Mooney called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible, please. Chester turned to me and said under his breath, "That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing, the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. Ma, Toby says he's gonna keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room. Only sometimes I thought when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't hurt that she shared his stash with him. It was, after all, at one of those late night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake. And Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing. And the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over me and pinned me by my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. But he's mine, Toby said. I found him. You sat on him, you mean? I found him and he's sleeping in my room. You can keep Smelly Old Harold in your room and Chester too, if you want to. But I'm gonna keep the rabbit in mine. Smelly Old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed it. His socks were weak, smelly indeed. Mr. Murnuch spoke up. "I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room, on that table by the window. It's light there, and he will get lots of fresh air." "Peter's taller than I am," Toby cried. "He'll be able to see the rabbit better." "Too bad, Squirt." "Okay," said Mrs. Munt through clenched teeth. "Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable. And then we can all get some sleep." "Why?" Pete asked. "I don't want to go to sleep." Mrs. Munt smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. "Look, Ma," said Toby. "He's not drinking his milk." Chad nutted me in the ribs. "Didn't I tell you?" he asked. "Excuse me while I make myself available." "Hey," said Toby, "we gotta name him." "Can that wait until tomorrow?" asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison. "No, he has to have a name right now." I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were really gonna call me Fluffy as Mrs. Monroe had suggested. "Well, all right," sighed Mrs. Monroe. "What about, oh, say, Bum Bum?" There she goes again, I thought. Where does she get them? Yuck, we all said. "Well, then how about the Fluffy?" she offered hopefully. Peter looked at his mother and smiled. "You never give up, do you, Ma?" Meanwhile, Chatter, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Monroe's ankles and pouting loudly. "No, Chatter, not now," she said, pushing him aside. "You want to help us name him, don't you, Chatter?" Toby asked, as he scooped him up into his arms. Chatter shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. "Come on, Harold," Toby called. "You've got to help me with the name, too." I joined the family and the serious thinking began. We all peeled into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. "This is a rabbit," I thought. He sort of looks like a Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail and a motor in his nose. "Well," said Pete after a moment, "since we found him at the movies, why don't we call him Mr. Johnson?" There was a moment of silence. "Who's Mr. Johnson?" asked Toby. "The guy who owns the movie theater," Pete answered. No one seemed to like the idea. "How about the prince?" said Mr. Monroe. "Dad," said Toby, "are you kidding?" "Well, I had a dog named the Prince once," he replied lamely. "Prince, I thought that's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula," Toby said. "That's a stupid name," said Pete. "No, it's not, and anyway, I found him, so I should get to name him." "Ma, you're not gonna let him name him, are you? That's favoritism, and I'll be traumatized if you do." Mrs. Mona looked in wonder at Pete. "Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula," cried Toby. "Please, please, please," and with each please, he squeezed the Chester a little harder. Mrs. Mona picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, "Let's not have any more argument. We'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him at a Dracula movie." So we'll call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula. That should make everybody happy, including me. What about me? Muttered Chester. I won't be happy until she puts down the milk. Well, guys, is that okay with you? She asked. Toby and Peter looked at one another, and then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. Yeah, Ma, I think that Ram is just right. Pete shrugged. It's okay, but I get to feed him. Okay, I'm gonna put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he will drink it tomorrow. What about Chester? Toby said, dropping the pretty cat to the floor. Maybe he would like it. Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Muno and looked up at her plaintively. Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester? You've already had your milk today. She reached down, patted Chester on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Chester didn't move. Okay, bedtime, said Mr. Mundo. Good night, Bunnicula, Toby said. Good night, Count Bunnicula, Pete said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. I licked it, Toby. Good night. Good night, Smelly Harold. Good night, Dumb Chester. I drew on Peter's foot. Mom, Harold drew on my foot. Good night, Pete. Mrs. Monroe said it with a great finality as she came back into the living room, and then more calmly, Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went up the stairs together. You know, dear, Mr. Monroe said, that was very clever. Bunnicula. I could never have thought of a name like that. Oh, I don't know, Robert. She smiled as she put her arm through his. I think Prince is a lovely name, too. The room was quiet. The chatter was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly, he turned to me. I wish they had named him Fluffy, was all he said. 자, 오늘 세 번 했고요. 이제 이렇게 함으로써 이제 총 95번, 이제 5번 남았습니다. 예, 최대한 열심히 해서 빨리 100번 맞춰보도록 하겠습니다.